Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining this session of Race and Education, the Hunt Institute's Race and Education webinar series on evidence-based approaches to challenging systemic racism in education. We have a really fantastic lineup for you today. Dr. Tequila Brownie, Executive Vice President of Strategy, Policy, and Community Coalitions at TNTP, Robert Rabin, President of the Rabin Group, and Cheryl Thompson, Director of Education Grant Making at the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Foundation. We're so grateful that you took some time out of your busy schedule, especially in this especially uncertain period of time, to come and have a conversation about how do we scale policy change for children of color in education, in policy, and in philanthropy. So again, we are so grateful, incredibly grateful that you've decided to join us for this conversation. Want to remind you, if you are following along online, feel free to tweet at us with a hashtag race and education. Hashtag race and education. We want to hear your impressions. We want to hear your opinions. We want to hear your reflections on how this conversation is going. And also, we want to hear your questions. So we have a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Make sure that you post your questions in there, and I will make sure to feed them to Dr. Browning. So again, thank you all so much for joining this absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the Hunt Institute team behind the scenes making this happen, Julia, Jen, Abigail, and James. And with that, I will pass it over to the man with the plan, my main partner on these race and education webinars, Ramon de Jesus, our Director of Equity Initiative.
Thank you, Senegal, and welcome to this week's episode in the Race and Education webinar series. My name is Ramon de Jesus, Director of Equity Initiatives here at the Hunt Institute. I'll do my best to keep my comments brief as we want to move this along to what you're all here for. So if this is your first connection with the Hunt Institute, we were created by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt in order to support the education policy needs of governors, state lawmakers, and other senior level state officials. Today's conversation continues to build on our Race and Education webinar series, where we look at key issues in the education landscape and how they intersect with issues of race. I'd like to thank our panelists today, Robert Rabin and Cheryl Thompson, for sharing your extremely valuable time with us. I'm also excited to have Dr. Tequila Brownie as a moderator for this conversation. Tequila, thank you for volunteering your time during these important moments in our country to really help us facilitate this amazing and important dialogue. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Brownie. Please take us away with some opening remarks.
Thank you, Ramon. Greetings, everyone. Happy to be here with you and facilitate our panel for today. I'll just open first. If those of you who signed up early may have recalled that our original moderator, who was supposed to be with us, is Lila Avila. Lila unfortunately passed away this week, and so I would like to just offer up a very brief moment of silence. If you can, please just join me in a moment of silence in honoring her. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me in that and honoring Lila's contributions to the field at large. It's just such a sad tragedy. I'd like to open up just first of all, introducing myself and just telling you a little bit about TNTP. So as Ramon said and Senegal said, I'm Tequila Brownie. I'm Executive Vice President at TNTP. I've been with TNTP for about 7 years, and some of you are familiar with TNTP. We do work across the country in ed reform, working with districts, state departments of education, charter schools, individual schools, and everything from academics, talent, policy work, supporting districts really to make sure that students are at the heart of the work and that we're disrupting educational inequities that we know persist despite all of our valiant efforts in education. I hail from, you may hear my Southern accent, I do live in the Deep South. I hail from the Delta in Arkansas and just near Memphis. I'd like to just open up just talking to our panelists, first of all, and thanking them again for their time. And just would ask you to, I have one question for you, and I'd love for you to answer your question. And as you answer it, I would love for you to also introduce yourselves to the panel as well. So my first question for our panelists, for you, Robert and Cheryl, is how have you seen philanthropy leaders and policymakers and education partners challenge systemic racism in education? So again, for our audience, the question is, how have you seen philanthropy leaders, policymakers, and education partners challenge systemic racism in education? We'd love to open that up first for you, Robert, to introduce yourself, and then jump right into our first question.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I appreciate you. I love that you have to tell people the Delta in Arkansas is near Memphis. Follow the music, follow the food. Thank you so much for having me. The Hunt Institute is just making the difference and has for years. Very much appreciate the opportunity to be on your platform and such an important platform. I am Robert Rabin. I run a public affairs government relations firm. Most of us are in Washington, although we're all over the country. We're in 9 cities. I think there are 90 of us. And we run campaigns, advocacy, communications, coalition management, et cetera. What distinguishes us is our demography. We are 95% minority and female. We're 70% people of color. There's no private sector agency in the nation with that demographic. And we're organized around social justice. The vast majority of what we do is shifting power to women and people of color. So the margins are low, but there's plenty of work. We stay busy at Raven. And you know, what's more important than the conversation about education? I'm really, really, really excited to be on a conversation with Cheryl Thompson at Schusterman. Not only is she the rock star at Schusterman, but she was a school teacher. And, you know, I bow to the school teachers from whom all wisdom and knowledge about everything, including public policy, should flow. So I'm eager to hear what you have to say. The short answer on sort of what we're doing on systemic racism and structural racism, philanthropy, government, et cetera, with the schools is not enough. There are fantastic standouts, and everybody on this screen is a standout. And my guess is most of the people plugged in are probably well ahead of the curve. But for a variety of reasons: one, the intractable problem of discrimination in the United States. 2, I think people have a hard time really accepting this. Schools in the United States of America are political institutions. There is a constant sort of distraction that they're not. But the design and the implementation of schooling, and not just public schooling, but I'm talking about the white academies that popped up throughout the country in response to forced desegregation, it's an entirely political system, just like policing. At the end of the day, it is accountable politically. People are elected to school boards. Mayors and county managers pick superintendents. And so if you want to see anything and try to make sense of it in a school system, then you have to accept that it's politics. And once you accept that it's politics, it all makes more sense. That resources are allocated as they are in pluralism with respect to your relative power. And that's not sort of, I don't mean that to have everybody flee and say, oh, it's intractable. People of color, people with fewer resources, who in many areas of the country are actually not people of color. I live in Washington, D.C., and one of the wealthiest counties in the United States is Prince George's, which is a majority African-American county. But generally speaking, race, ethnicity is conflated with economics, and political power flows accordingly. But, you know, I'll say in a very positive way. We elected Barack Obama president of the United States twice. In a deeply racist country, he cobbled together an electoral majority twice. So we can do anything, and it requires focus and discipline and accepting that this is politics. And if you want your politics to change, you have to get involved. You can't sit on your sofa and talk about how mean the other side is.
Thank you so much, Robert. I think to your point, we definitely are at a time when we've seen possible And we're at an opportunity sort of at a crossroads where we can see what's possible moving forward. And even that still has not been enough, to your point. So I appreciate your response. Cheryl, I'll come to you and ask sort of the same question just to tee it up again for our audience. How have you seen philanthropy leaders and policymakers and education partners challenge systemic racism in education? We'd love for you to first introduce yourself and then jump into our first question.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll start by way of introduction. You'll hear a little bit of who I am in the background. My youngest of 5 are ages 4 and 6 and in school right now, virtually in dance class. And so you'll see and experience a bit of who I am. But my background, as Robert said, I was a teacher. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, born and raised. I was the kid in kindergarten when they said, what do you want to be? And I had a pointer and a grade book. I know that ages me, but let's not do that. And so that's who I was. I was a teacher, became a charter leader in DC. So have that public school teaching experience and charter leader experience as well. And then moved on to nonprofit area. Had the opportunity to work for New Leaders and then in KIPP Foundation, and ended up here in philanthropy, which was not a choice that I thought I'd end up with, but here I am, and I'm excited that I've had this opportunity for the last 3 years because of what Robert said. I came on because of Schusterman's focus on having educators be involved in how education plays out, which is just a good place to start. And so I think also, like Robert said, when I thought about this question, my first thought was, I don't know that I've seen that. I'm not sure that I've seen funders and policymakers and educators work together. I think my best answer right now, that's my son singing and dance. I think the best answer I would offer is that for us, we do Gen Ops grants, which allows us to say we trust the school as an entity, the administrators, to make the decisions for how they need to spend that funding. And that is to be able to say, we know the problems ourselves here, and we can say how to solve them. And I would say that is I think, trust, leaning in to say, we understand a community can define the problem for itself. But I don't know that I've seen a ton of it. I think I'd wonder if you think about when funders support civil rights policy, is that putting pressure? I'm not really sure, but I don't think I can think of right now any way that I could say a concrete example of how they're all working together. And so just offer up what we do to try to signal what we should do, which is allow those who are in the community to define the problem and how it should be solved, and then support them in how they want to implement that solution.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, and appreciate your experience both prior to Schusterman and then in your support and the support of the Schusterman Foundation in education more broadly, and appreciate the background noise. I think it keeps us all grounded. It probably brings a little joy to some of us on this pretty tense week, so appreciate that.
You know, Doctor, I want to add something. I know we have a flow, but
oh, please jump in. Absolutely.
Well, Ms. Thompson just reminded me the other sort of vector, and why your question is fantastic, is what do we mean by education? That it's no longer a term of art. And, you know, I think for those who are in the academy, it's about curriculum and accountability and learning and nurturing. But because it's a political system, the reality is education is food service and transportation and policing, regrettably, and social work and anti-domestic violence. So there's no aspect of modern American society that is not foisted upon the school system to, at a minimum, worry about and a maximum fix. So when you look at it in that context, there's a constant amount of effort at the federal and state level to bring an equity lens to education. So the fact that, you know, Medicaid will reimburse a school system for transportation for disabled students who need it, right? That's just sort of an example of a federal effort. But so we have lots and lots of examples of engineering through policy to allocate resources. The central problem is, of course, the schools are asked to be everything to everybody. what I first said at the top of the hour, which is who decides in a political system? And are we at the table enough?
You make me think, Robert, about one of my favorite authors and historians of education, Patricia Albert Graham at Harvard, who's written about the aims of education. And it basically, for our audience purposes, just basically underlies the premise that we put on the backs of education what we are too afraid or cowardly, if you want to use a stronger word, to deal with as a society. So the aims of education being, assimilation earlier, then about access during the civil rights movement, then, allegedly achievement during NCLB in those times. And history is yet to be written about, I think now, what do we really mean when we say education, and what is the societal aim for education? So I appreciate you triggering, and again, that's Patricia Albert Graham at Harvard, I think, who's a really great historian on the purpose of and the aims of education as we think of it. My next question, Cheryl, is for you actually. And again, I would love to hear from your direct voice how you envision and how you would articulate that the Schusterman Family Foundation has sort of stepped up to the plate on behalf of, as a funding organization that works on behalf of students of color.
Sure. So I'm excited to say Schusterman's done a few things, and we're working right now in collaboration with other funders through collaboratives and funder work groups to figure out how we can amplify the voices of leaders of color on behalf of students of color, and that happens in a few ways. Speaking directly to the portfolio I run, it's called Equity by Design, which is a little on the nose with intentionality. So the headline there is that we're focused on the retention of educators of color, the retention not driving diversity into, because if you think about it as a pipeline and a leaky bucket, why would you want to push and pour folks into a system that's going to lose them because they're going into inequitable environments? So we supported initially using an analogy of fish and water, where we wanted to both inoculate the fish, who we define as leaders by the role of principal or above in a system. So you work in an inequitable environment. How do you understand, A, what that meant for you as a student of color, B, what that means for you in your role as a leader of color, and C, how does that play out for what you do in your role, both righting the inequities that you see and maintaining in an environment that's inequitable yourself. And then cleaning the water itself, which is we've worked with systems to help them go through an equitable redesign process, if you will, to identify policies and practices that are inequitable and then redesign them with the objective of the student experience in mind. So that's what one specific portfolio has done, to sort of understand how can you keep those who are doing the good work there and help them to transform the environments they're in from within. And then how can you take leaders from the leadership level, that was superintendent, CAO level, and say from the top, identify policies and practices that are inequitable, and then talk about how we redesign them with our students forefronted. So that's one thing, that's what the portfolio has done. As an education team, we're sort of taking this equity lens up to say, what does it really mean for students to live in culturally affirming environments? And how does that play out across all of the pipeline? If you think about Schusterman, we sort of have a tagline around like we heart teachers. So we think about our funding over the life cycle of a teacher. So in teacher prep, what does that mean to make sure that there are more diverse voices and represented going into education, and that the curriculum there is preparing and sustaining them? When you're in the role, how are you supporting teachers in that role with culturally affirming practices to be able to engage and have students to high quality that speaks to them? And then what are the materials that you're putting in hand to make sure, again, that it's affirming and reinforcing the content that's relevant to all and historically accurate? And so as a team, we're sort of driving toward how can we impact those things, and then working more broadly, like I said, with other funders and funder collaboratives and funder work groups to say, how can we make sure that in this world of nonprofit focus on education, that we're looking at leaders of color who are focused on students of color to solve problems that they themselves can identify and co-create solutions with. And so making sure that as we partner with other funders, we're going into and beyond our networks that can be very sort of insular to say, where are the leaders doing this work well? How do we identify where they are, amplify excellence in action, as opposed to saying, we don't know where it is or where does it exist? And then make sure that as we're doing that, we're putting visibility there, amplifying them. And I would say the key again is beyond your networks. We want to try to make sure we don't just over dial on a small few who've got sort of name recognition and continue to overinvest, but how do we use that to broaden the network and say, where are communities getting this right? Where are folks co-creating and being able to have success? How can we amplify that? And then figure out how to continue to support folks who are doing that well. So I'll pause there to see if there are other questions, but that's sort of the work we've begun to do and how we're continuing to march forward.
That's helpful. My follow-up question, I guess, would love to hear an example of within that strategy and portfolio of something that you're seeing most impactful, or that you are just seeing some early promise from it. I know sometimes we get a little bit ahead of ourselves as far as impact, but would love to hear something you're really excited about within your portfolio, or just seeing some really early promise or impact.
Sure. So there was a community of practice portion to sort of clean the water. We worked directly with 5 systems who picked a policy or practice at the system level to redesign. And we took them through an 18-month community of practice that started last January and wrapped up this May. Through that, we were excited to say all 5 systems did select a district-wide policy or practice to redesign, and all did that redesign. And COVID happened in March before we were ending. And so this was all a learning agenda, if you will, for us to understand the enabling conditions for leaders to be set up to make this transformation. And we did learn some exciting information about like having the superintendent directly engaged, having the chief academic officer directly involved, and what does that mean, and getting them proximate to students. So a big part of that was you're redesigning a discipline practice because you've noticed that you've over-dialed on African-American girls. Great. Now go do superintendent interviews with African-American girls who have been on the receiving end of this discipline policy to understand their experience and what could look differently. And so exciting to say all 5 systems actually did redesign a policy or practice. And when COVID arrived, the next step was for them to say, that's one practice, you have an entire system, so how do we work over time? Then COVID came and said, or you can redesign everything right now. And so I'm excited, if you will, that folks saw that as the opportunity to take this work farther. Instead of backing away and saying, I'm overwhelmed, how do I set up my system as it exists? We're like, well, this wasn't working. How do I take this equitable redesign lens and put it in my COVID response plan? If I know that one-to-one is an issue, I won't do a survey that's electronic. I will go into a neighborhood and do paper surveys or do a phone tree. And so I think early indicators of success are that all 5 systems were able to identify a policy or practice and redesign. And then I would say all of them, when COVID came, we were sort of at the end of that and could have said, let's close this out in March. But instead, all 5 system leaders were like, nope, if we can continue to have touch points to figure out how we execute this plan and don't lose the equitable lens, that I think was exciting for us to hear that they genuinely were interested, learning from one another and able to take from the redesign of one practice and then implement that work into their response to COVID. And so they're obviously at different spaces and places, but we do have systems that are, like one in particular, they're redesigning everything and have done an audit across their entire system to figure out how they need to shift and rebuild in this time. So those are just like early emerging promising practices, and we'll continue to learn as we keep working with them.
That is fascinating and really inspiring to hear. So I definitely appreciate you sharing that. And speaking of shifts, right? I think my question, Robert, for you is, I mean, COVID is one example of something that sort of did in fact tilt the earth on its axis, and to put it mildly. But as we think about state and federal government and the judiciaries that are out there are constant shifts. And so given those constant shifts, how would you recommend that education leaders approach their efforts to both scale and sustain policy change on behalf of students of color?
I love it. Thank you very much for asking. I'll key off what Cheryl said. You know, each of those districts has an idea, and then that idea becomes something. So I'll turn it to what you just asked me. There's 2 things that it requires, I think, for great change. One is vision. People underestimate the role of a great idea. I know that's a very basic thing to say, but I'm going to elaborate on in a second. Number one is vision, and number two is unlikely allies. That in an increasingly balkanized culture, the importance of not writing anybody off as your potential partner. So on the vision side, you know, nurse-family partnership starts as somebody's idea. And pre-K now starts as somebody's idea. These things are not designed in a factory. Some likely woman who knew what she was talking about had an idea and did the following. So one is vision. I'll editorialize a little and say, you know, one of the people I've ever read about that I admire the most is Fannie Lou Hamer, who we know the speech she delivered at the 1964 Democratic Convention with her purse on the table. I asked Eleanor Holmes Norton, who worked for Mrs. Hamer, sort of how she delivered that spontaneously. There were no notes, and Mrs. Norton, who cantankerous, says she couldn't read or write. So a woman who is not functionally able to read her own speech has the vision to create the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, because the parties won't have her, and works with other people to say, well, let's try an alternative party, runs for Congress, opens up a co-op for other farmers and sharecroppers, develops Black freedom schools. I'll go on and on and on. My guess is I never met her, but my guess is she never once said, you know, the minute I get that grant from the Ford Foundation, I'm going to start a Black freedom school. So for me, vision first, and have the confidence to pursue your idea and stop waiting for the man to tell you what your blessing is. So that's one. And then two, the unlikely allies. I'm an ideologue. I'm a very strong left-winger, and I'm almost, you know, dysfunctional given how left-wing I am. But in my day job, I'm devoted to moving public policy, which means I choose to work with people I either don't care for or I disagree with, because my goal is to influence them to move progressively on public policy issues. And I'm old enough to know and see that everything is movable. Nothing in culture is immovable. The Pope, just erroneously or not, just said civil unions for gay people is okay. Everything is movable, and I'll give you one of my favorite examples. We're in a squabble in education around the utility of vouchers, and my people on the left frequently say, oh, vouchers are terrible. Obamacare is a voucher program. If you qualify, you are given a fixed amount from the government, and you then take that fixed amount, and depending on what exchange you're in, you buy from different options. We don't call it a voucher program, it's a voucher program. By here, I don't mean to have a substantive debate on voucher programs. I mean to say you can work with anybody on anything if you cut through the false thicket and focus on what we're trying to do, what our common needs are, and what compromises do we have to make in order to work together. So vision and allyship.
I appreciate that. For those of you that did not know, Lila, our original moderator today, she's was the founding executive director of and CEO of EdLock, Education Leaders of Color. And Robert has worked closely with Lila and with EdLock. I'm on the board in full disclosure, but I appreciate the organization's third way approach to your point, and thinking about these issues in a way that is potentially less divisive, but it's going that next level deeper, right? Where we don't fall into sort of that policy pigeonhole where we pit one group against the other, thinking that that's our way to keep anything from happening. And I appreciate, Robert, your point that nothing is unmovable. We're going to shift at this point and actually go to some of our audience questions. And I have there are some that are already teed up. I saw that. So Cheryl, we've gotten a lot of questions for you specifically, people wanting to hear more about some of the specific policies that the districts that you referenced had defined and what the ones that they were actually tackling.
Sure, happy to share. So we had one district, and I should say we roughly this was a small test for us. We had a learning agenda to, again, understand the enabling conditions to support leaders in making this type of transformation. So we worked together over 18 months and set up front. The requirement was, just for context, that the superintendent, chief academic officer, and if you had one, chief equity officer, had to be engaged in the community of practice, which meant attending the convenings and webinars. The second thing was to round out your team. We wanted proximity, so we suggested principal, teacher, or students as well. And a big part of this process was about proximity. So all throughout, we continued to go back to student voice and having their experiences guide what was done. So, and we focused on system populations that were high populations of low income Black and Latinx students. So with one system, there was a push for the white parents in the district against some English language learners. And this was an issue because the majority of their district were students who spoke were English language learners in one way or another. And so the policy that they decided to redesign was in their elementary school. So they wanted to redesign all of their elementary school classrooms to be dual immersion. This was to help make the experience of the English language learners more resonant for all of the students and families, and as a way to grow toward, it's just obviously just great practice as well. So that was one policy that was enacted completely, in addition to making all of the elementary schools in that system, no thank you son, dual immersion. They also switched their elementary report card to the one that was around, yes, you can go outside. To the one that went along with the dual emergency, the dual immersion curriculum, which is a standards-based report card. So all of their districts have now gone to that level of report card structure. We had another system who was a CMO that was sort of founded in the beginning with, I wouldn't say equity at its core, but with acknowledgement of being in Atlanta in that context. And so as a leadership team that were full of members of color, they actually wanted to pressure test whether or not equity existed. And so they started to identify around grading in the high school as an explicit policy that they wanted to review, and then decided that what they needed to do as an entire leadership team was to do an audit across the board. And so they did an entire district level, if you will, audit, and now have all their principals going through the same redesign process that we went through and are doing an audit across their entire system. We had another CMO in the sort of Fort Worth area. They redesigned the way that they do discipline to have restorative practices, restorative justice be implemented in how they approach their students. And they pushed to get student data broken down by subgroups, which was new for their CMO. We had a larger system in the same area identify the discipline of African-American girls, which was disproportionate to the number of African-American girls in the system. They did redesign their policy that had several components. Some were directed toward the students, so like Girls Inc. and what they could do to be advocates for themselves. One was to make a line item in the budget that these girls would now own around professional learning for teachers and leaders in the system. And then they also had additional professional learning around bridging the gap between, they noticed an interesting trend where the students had positive relationship with the principals who tended to be people of color, but poor interactions with the teachers who tended to be white. And so just navigating that dynamic. And then the last system, again, took an approach where they decided their small test, if you will, we asked them all to do a small test, was to take all of their principals through this redesign process as well. And so they were one to, again, sort of self-identified saying, we don't have one policy here. We recognize that as a leadership team, we need to do an audit and then think about how we're implementing this. And so they chose to take everyone in the district through this and then have their principals now go through a system redesign so that they can select individual school policies and practices. So happy to speak more. And again, the way we sort of selected folks to participate, we wanted rough north, south, east, west representation. And what we got was a small system outside of Boston, 25 school district, where the leader was an African-American man, first time in the role, but as far as like leaders of color in his system, it's himself, 2 vice principals and a special ed coordinator. In the Atlanta CMO, the entire leadership team were made up of folks of color. The CMO in the Fort Worth area, the leader was a Latina woman and their leadership team were folks of color. Fort Worth was a system where the leadership team itself was diverse, but has a white man leader. And then in St. Louis was a diverse leadership team led by an African-American man. And so we wanted to get a sort of mix of leaders of color, Latinx, and Black, and then again, a focus on a student population that had large numbers of low Black and Latinx students.
Thank you, Cheryl, for that detailed response. I think we got several questions, so I think folks were appreciative to hear that. I'm going to take one of our next questions that we got, Robert, and actually kick it to you, and I may come in as well. We got a question about what does redesigning staffing at schools and challenge learning environments look like? So as we think about the quote unquote hard to staff schools, the question is, we often say we don't want to force teachers to work there, which seems to be an enabling condition. Would just love to hear your thoughts on how we think about redesigning staffing in challenged learning environments.
I'm going to kick that to the teacher whose multitasking skills are preternatural. I focus on public policy and stay away from, I just don't know best practices. I listen to my friends in the unions, but I know that's just one important voice, but I'll defer to Cheryl on sort of a scholar and a teacher's perspective on how to handle that.
Appreciate it, Robert, but don't know that I have much more to offer. How do you staff hard to staff schools? Wow, I think that's a great question. In part, I think it's about preparation in general, like what makes a school hard to staff and whose description. I do think there are master educators there. I think oftentimes the system, because it is a political place, can drive out folks who work well with hard to staff schools. I'm sorry. Yes, you can have cookies. And so I don't know is my honest answer. I would say that there are teachers there who are doing well. I wonder how we're looking for them or how we're identifying what a quality teacher is. And then I would say a little bit, how are you listening to effective teachers? Like what you would identify as a teacher who's been successful? How are we talking to them about where they came from, why they stay, and how they can get more of their friends to come along? So a lot of my answers, because I recognize that I am now so far away, I would say you need to go directly to the folks who are doing it and ask them. Not as a punt, but it's just like, how else can you actually get an answer that's viable?
And jump in here. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Robert.
Well, the antecedent question is, why something hard to staff? How did the political system allow it to get to us, putting aside the bias of what is that, who decides whether something's hard to staff or not? How did we get to this point where that was acceptable? And the question is, who's going to handle this awful situation? If there's some stuff that's sort of just, it is what it is, then you do what you do at elite organizations. So the federal government offers combat pay for people who are willing to be diplomats in quote, tough areas, end quote. And there's a concomitant recognition that much more is being asked of this professional than another. So that may be in order. I will comment, Cheryl, that your child is a natural public policy advocate.
Yes.
Questions when you are vulnerable and weak and likely to say yes. I love.
And by design.
That child would like to join. Please let me know.
I noticed that too, Robert was going to say, I think we all can take some lessons from that script. I'll comment on the question some is from my perspective at TNTP, who we do sort of get into talent work and staffing and supporting schools. I think Robert's question first and Robert's response is that how do we get there in the first place is absolutely one piece of the puzzle in answering that question. Prior to joining TNTP, I actually led talent and staffing work in Memphis, in Memphis City Schools for about, I was in the district about 9 years, and we had a whole set of schools that we did define as hard to staff, and how they got that characterization was the teachers always wanted to transfer out, and when they did have openings, no one was applying to transfer into those schools, basically. So high turnover. But you've got to look at how they became that way. The school culture, the leadership of the school. We had teachers weren't leaving our district. We had about 200 schools, about 8,000 teachers. And teachers didn't leave the district quite that often. They would leave a school. And so that tells you something about sort of the root cause of the problem and where you've got to intervene as you want to really invest there. And we actually, one of the things that we did, we prioritized those schools. So instead of them being last to the table to get access to the candidate pool, we shifted it where they were first to the table. We also did do incentivized pay for those teachers, recognizing, Robert, to your point, you know, combat pay in the military, thinking about teachers going into those challenging environments for lots of different reasons. And there were perceptions that weren't always accurate. I want to say that as well, because poverty, high poverty didn't always equal a challenged learning environment, but there was the perception there. So you had teachers that didn't want to leave their non-Title I school, but wanted to, in fact, you know, stay at a Title I school. So we did think about, you know, from a financial perspective, incentivizing that. And then we hit the school cultures head on. We figured out a way to measure school culture and then really work with the leadership in those schools to try to really try to shift that. So I have a separate question for you, Robert, I guess. What is the role of organized labor as you think about addressing systemic racism in education? How do unions both amplify the need for change for policies at the district and state level, and how do they stand in the way of the change?
They play a fantastic role in, well, let me say this. They're magnificently important because they're the largest and most important institution that accepts the fact that I started this conversation with, that the distribution of resources in education is a political question. There's a moral overlay, there's an accountability, but it is alpha and omega, a political question, and resources are distributed in a political system based on power. So their effectiveness is unrivaled at the local level because they have accepted the fact that this is politics. Everything flows from that as they increasingly recognize that not just diversity, but inclusion and equity of mostly women of color in their ranks is about sustainability. Whether or not it's the right thing to do, it's about their sustainability. They are getting better and better and better at promoting equity. But it's limited. They're organized around, they care deeply, of course, about the children. Many of them are parents, but they're organized around wages and benefits. That is why they are organized. That is why they are involved in politics. And so that is sometimes different than what we are talking about, which is the well-being of every child and the sustenance of every child. When they conflate, it's great. And when they don't, we have our problems. But the answer to that, so unions are a terrific and powerful force for moving equity, period. But it's insufficient. People of color and white allies need to engage forcefully in the politics of education. Who's on your school board? Who's your county manager? Whether or not your mayor is distributing resources in a way that you think is appropriate. And it's about voting, but it's about showing up and holding them accountable. It's about having an agenda. We certainly have the institutions through which to do it, the churches and the community organizations and activism and online. Open question whether we're doing it.
Thank you, Robert. You know, you hit on something, I think, as you think about the rank and file and engaging them. There was a question in the chat similarly around the role of parents as we think about equity in education and race. And so would love to hear perhaps my background as a school. So I worked as a school social worker, not as a teacher, but I know that one of my frustrations in my role as a school social worker was this invisible Berlin Wall sometimes between what was happening for students in their experience within the four walls of the school versus what was happening with their families and at home. And that was one of my frustrations, and how just we were set up from a policy perspective to support students as a school social worker. But I'll ask you, Cheryl, as you think about your work and what you're seeing in these districts and some of these CMOs that you all are working with, how are you all thinking about the role of parents and community as you're advocating for change?
It's co-creator, and like that's just where we are. I think it's such a powerful thing, both as a teacher, former teacher, and principal, as a parent of kids ages 4 to 21, and kids who've been in everything from public to private to parochial to now to homeschool. And I don't just mean COVID-19, I mean like a homeschool collaborative. Parents serve that co-creating role. And I think COVID has helped us understand that in ways that we had forgotten or ignored or pretended didn't exist, right? To your point, there was a wall, and parents were often them. And it was often reciprocal, because if you have not a great experience as a child and then grow up, you might react to your student's entity in a similar way that you yourself had an experience. And so co-creator, I would say, is the role that we have parents and communities play, both in the systems that we're working with and as we think about our grant making writ large. And I think leaning into the opportunity COVID has provided to say parents are the first learners, and you're co-creators with a successful student. And so working with them to understand everything from how do we understand what mastery looks like in this environment? Because it's not the kids cease learning, they learn all the time, every day. To how do we then take all this beautiful knowledge of how we have co-created this relationship in this circumstance as we walk back into what a new educational system could look like once the pandemic is under control, whatever that means. And so I just can't say enough that both in our specific grant making and as a team, we're focused on that co-creation with parents and communities to help identify the problem and to help us resource for them how they want to solve it.
Thanks, Cheryl. As we think about the work that to your point, how we've approached things in the past, Robert, my question for you is, what do you think the last 4 years have taught ed reformers about the opportunity to collaborate on ed issues and shape public policy?
I'm smiling because we're a stubborn bunch. I'm not sure. Well, let me not be that cynical. I think many of us who are organized in public policy and advocacy, as we get farther along the learning curve, become less than great listeners. We're sort of, we know what we want, we know what we need, we know what we got to do, fight. And if it doesn't work, we fight harder. What I think the last 4 years have shown us is obviously deep divisions in our country, which is not a surprise to me. I just think you have different primacy in power as time shifts, who's in power. What has shown me is the importance and power of reaching across an aisle, working with, and whether that's a political aisle or sort of an ideological aisle, and trying to figure out how I can get people to agree with me, that the destructiveness of staring at each other from across our divides and hurling insults and lobs at each other and hoping that one beats the other corrodes us all. But I think in education, as in so many other areas, there's still a very significant majority of people who want their children to be safe, who want to know that when they leave the door or there's a drop off, that they're going to be able to return that child in from a violence-free environment, that there's a quality education, that there's accountability, that there's cultural sensitivity. So I'm still a strong believer in that being an amazing unifier. And I think the public policy advocates will do a lot better if we take our medication or do what we need to do and find those allies that we have been indifferent to over the years. It's crucial to move forward.
Thank you. I have one final question, I think, as we close out for each of you. And I'll start with you, Robert, since you were on a roll, I feel like. So it's the flip side. What have we learned? But now the flip side, looking ahead, what's one thing that you hope that education policymakers and philanthropists and administrators and leaders accomplish in the next 4 years if they work together with community members to solve problems in these very uncertain times?
Okay, thank you. A couple of things I appreciate you saying. I'm on a roll, which is code for talk faster. One, which is a little bit out of left field, but I'll say it. We all need to do a much deeper dive on what it means to be Latino in the United States. I think this election is showing, and I've known it for a long time, we have exceptionally insufficient learning as a culture about the history of the American Latino culture, how Hispanics do or don't align with each other on everything: politics, culture, history, language, pro-immigrant, not pro-immigrant. And I'm raising this because I think increasingly the educational systems throughout America are serving and heavily influenced by the question of the Latino family. And I think our understanding of what that means is primordial. And we will pay the cost if people don't do a much deeper dive on the diversity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's obviously not the only thing going on, but it's something that I'm staring at that if we don't get a grip on soon, it's going to be terrible for outcomes. And the second thing is what you've heard me say twice, which is we're going to have divided government federally. I don't know how many times people have to see that you can't win by clobbering the other side. You win when we figure out our commonality, our common humanity, come up with public policy and language that works for most people, which requires compromise, which I think is a joyous word, not a dirty word, and keep it moving.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert. Cheryl, same question to you. Looking ahead, what's one thing you hope that education policymakers and philanthropists and administrators accomplish in the next 4 years if they work together with community members?
I think it's much of what Robert said about this co-creation piece, just what I said before. Working together to understand where are the shared outcomes and how we can get there. And really just thinking about things from that standpoint, figuring out where are there places where we all want the same thing, how can we make that happen, and how do we listen to one another? Not just, sometimes you feel like folks want to sort of harvest the experiences of students of color or people, but how do we actually work together to understand what's driving how folks are behaving, what's driving the identification of problems, and then work together to come up with solutions. So I really would just focus in on that co-creating piece.
That is about all the time I think that we have. I just want to thank you, Robert. Thank you, Cheryl, both for joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel. Appreciate our audience members and all of their questions. I actually want to invite Senegal now to share some of the Hunt Institute resources and close us out today.
No, sure. I just want to echo those amazing thank yous. This has been an absolutely incredible panel, and we are so grateful at the Hunt Institute for all of you joining us, for you sharing your insight and your perspective. This is an incredibly tumultuous period, but I think your ideas, your enthusiasm, and your engagement has made the utmost difference for those trying to make policy change. We have several webinars happening here at the Hunt Institute, and we hope that all of them are just as engaging as this. I'm about to share one in the chat for those of you who want to join another post-election conversation with some amazing panelists. So we really hope that you're able to join us for that conversation happening on November 12th at 7 p.m. And again, thank you to all of you who have joined this Hunt Institute webinar. I think we may be able to give you 4 minutes back of your time, but our panelists have been so great. And again, thank you so much.